Well, hello, everyone. I'm Mandana Kelili, Professor of Medicine, Director of the UCSF Research Coordinating Center's Investigator Development Unit of the NIMHD Health Equity Action Network. I'd like to welcome you to our monthly training webinar. Before we start, we'd like to... Amanda, would you mind sharing? Yes, thank you. We would like to acknowledge the Ramaytush Ulani people who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the Ramaytush Ulani elders, past, present, and future, who call this place the land that UCSF sits upon their home. We're proud to continue their tradition of coming together, growing as a community. And we thank the Ramaytush Ulani community for their stewardship and support. We look forward to strengthening our ties as we continue our relationship of mutual respect and understanding. Great. Well, today we are honored to have Dr. Andy Tompkins speak to us about disparities in substance use disorder diagnosis and treatment entry among lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer adults. Dr. Tompkins is currently the director of the Division of Substance Abuse and Addiction Medicine at Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital and professor of clinical psychiatry and behavioral sciences at UCSF School of Medicine, an incredible collaborator as well. He earned his medical degree at New York Medical College, completed his internship and residency in psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Hospital, after which he completed his fellowship in behavioral pharmacology and addictions in the Johns Hopkins Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit and a master's degree in health sciences and clinical investigation. Dr. Tompkins is the recipient of NIH, SAMHSA, and industry-sponsored research grants, especially in the areas of patient navigation, chronic pain, and medication development for the treatment of opioid use disorders, and has numerous publications in these areas. Lastly, Dr. Tompkins has been a strong advocate for the LGBTQIA+ community, leading the newly formed subcommittee in the College of Problems of Drug Dependence. Dr. Tompkins, we're honored to have you here and welcome. We look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. And I'm going to share my screen before we get started. And you guys going to let me know if it appears correct. Does that look good?
It's perfect. Perfect. Thank you.
Full screen. Great.
No. And first off, thank you for that introduction. And second off, thank you for your time. This is a time for us to be together, to learn, to go through a journey of one particular patient that's close to my heart. That will go through a lot of the issues that we'll be talking today. And the last time I gave a talk on this subject was 10 years ago, and I was hoping that a lot of things have changed, and yes, they have, but a lot of things are similar to when I last talked about this subject. We have three main agenda items. We're first going to provide an overview of terminology and acronyms, including why pronouns matter. And I encourage everyone, if they want to rename themselves with their pronouns during this talk, you feel free to do that. We're going to define minority stress theory and apply it to the development of substance use disorders in the LGBTQ+ community. And I'm going to describe the disparities in the use of substances and prevalence of SUDs, comparing LGBTQ+ individuals to cisgender heterosexual peers, using a lot of different data sets, including national population level data sets. I like questions, and feel free to put questions in the chat or to raise your hand or to unmute yourself since we're a small group and ask questions during the talk. I know Mandana will be monitoring the chat and interrupting me if there's a particular question, and I appreciate that, and I love that. And we're here together, so this is your time. So I encourage you to focus on this if you can. I find that being mindful about doing one thing at a time can make all of us a little bit happier today. And I'm a clinician, so I'm going to start, as I said, describing Mr. T. So he is a 33-year-old gay cisgender male with major depressive disorder who was recently arrested for his second DUI, who is presenting to your clinic or to your research collaboration for an evaluation. In terms of his family history, he reports being the third of 6 children, to parents who identify as Southern Baptists and are active in their with the faith community. He has a family history of depression, possible bipolar disorder, and a sister. He's not too sure about that, as well as a family history of alcohol and drug addiction. And you'll get to know Mr. T throughout this journey. You'll hear about heartbreaks. You'll hear about resilience. And hopefully it will tie into a lot of things that we'll be learning about today. To begin with, terminology and acronyms. I'm an acronym lover. I think all of my research studies have unique acronyms. They're acronym builders on the internet, as well as using your friends. My most recent study, I'm thinking of trying to call it Bibimbap. But today we're here to talk about different types of terms and terminology. And the first thing is to remind you that we are all one individual made up of lots of different interesting facets and parts. And there are differences between sex, gender, and sexual orientation. And we'll quickly review a little bit about those today in the next couple of slides. To begin with, sex is described as the physical attributes of an individual, usually present at birth. Usually it's defined by sexual organs, chromosomes, etc. And it's very different from gender, and gender can be broken down into identity and expression. Gender identity is how one internally labels one's gender, whether that be male, female, transgender, or another identity such as genderqueer. Transgender individuals specifically identify with a different sex than one assigned at birth. Cisgender individuals identify with the sex they were assigned at birth, so it's a clear delineation there. And this is gender expression, is the way that you express your internal sense of gender. And not everyone is comfortable expressing their internal sense to the public. However, when you are, your behavior, your mannerisms, your interests, and your appearance are being evaluated by those around you. And then they're usually associated with a societal construct, depending upon what society you live in, as being feminine, masculine, something in between, or something different. And then an umbrella term is gender minority. It's the same thing with sexual minority, are those individuals that have a minority gender identity, such as people that don't identify as cisgender in this particular United States community. And they could identify as transgender, genderqueer, or lots of other acronyms that we use in a lot of the studies today. Now, persons who have gender identity, transgender, or cisgender, they have sexual orientations, and it's not always the same thing. In fact, they're different. Sexual orientation is really the attraction that a person has to people primarily of the same sex, the opposite sex, both sex, or multiple genders and sexes. And that's a relatively new term called pansexual that people are using. And as we'll get into a little bit later, bisexual is actually the most common sexual orientation other than heterosexual in the United States today. Sexual identity is your own internal sense of your sexuality. Usually people can use terms like gay, straight, bisexual, or other terms, or some people don't like to label themselves and will use an umbrella term such as queer, or prefer not to answer on our wonderful surveys that we have. Behaviors are something that, just because somebody has an attraction, just because somebody identifies does not necessarily mean that they're going to behave in the way that we think we do. So you really have to ask about behavior. And we ask about sexual behaviors, including no sexual behavior at all. And because there are certain behaviors, of course, that have an increased risk for STIs and other consequences of their sexual behavior. And so it's important to know and ask about all three of those. And then we have an umbrella term, because we like umbrella terms, sexual minority. I'll use that to define somebody who does not identify as heterosexual. So that could be gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, or another label. I'm a part of the group for the advancement of psychiatry, specifically the LGBT community, and we have a wonderful website that has learning materials primarily meant for psychiatrists, but can be for anyone, where we go through a lot of the terminology as well as the history of a psychiatric diagnosis of homosexuality and a lot of other fun tidbits and, of course, quizzes and things like that. So I encourage you to check that out if you have time. And I talk about acronyms. And so this is the current acronym that you might see, LGBTQIA, and this identifies what all those letters stand for. Things that we haven't mentioned so far include intersex, which we don't talk a lot about today, but it's a biological condition where people are born with genital organs of both sexes. It's often a genetic condition. And there's been a lot of work in this area. And a lot of problems that people have because oftentimes their parents would want to assign them a sex at birth, and then it comes into problems as they grow up into their adulthood. And as a reminder, not everyone likes sex, and not everyone's comfortable with sexual contact. And those are the asexual individuals that identify as asexual. And although they don't have any interest in sex, they of course are interested in partnership. And so it's another interesting facet. And there's a plus because there's always more individuals to be added to our wonderful umbrella. This is now in the fourth iteration. This is the genderbread. Notice the misspelling, which really puts it all together. It's a nice slide to use, especially if you're working with kids, adolescents, or even adulthoods, which talks about how all these facets come together to create one human being and reminds us that identity, expression, sex are not the same. And that just because you have one thing doesn't mean you have the other. So I encourage you also to read about the genderbread person and use it in your slides. So we've gone through terminology and acronyms, and I want to come back to Mr. T. So in his upbringing, he noticed that he was different from other boys in his elementary school. He didn't like to play sports. He preferred either alone time or to read. And then he became aware of same-sex attraction in middle school. He was constantly being berated for his lisp and his gesturing, specifically the way he crossed his legs and the way that he kept his wrists bent. And he really was encouraged by his family and those at school to act more masculine. He was bullied very regularly. He did find some relief in church. However, he kept hearing messages that being gay was a sin akin to murder. And when he became aware of his same-sex attraction, he then started to think, is he like a murderer? Is he going to grow up to be somebody that is among one of the most socially ostracized individuals in this country? He talks about praying to God to make him straight every day. And it was a terrible, terrible time for him. He went off to college where he was so stigmatized in his behavior that he had a girlfriend, in which he was sexually active. But he also on the side had anonymous sexual contact, so anonymous that he didn't want another person's name. He drove out of state to have this contact and had no contact after that. And so was putting himself at risk for a lot of complications, but that's where he was at that time in his upbringing. After college, at his parents' encouragement, where he's starting to talk about this sex attraction, they encouraged him and sent him to a lay religious group to attempt sexual orientation change, which is all, unfortunately, very common in the religiously conservative communities. And this was not successful and left a lot of scars. You know, and this is emotional for me. And so, but, you know, there are some good things at the end, but these are the journeys that a lot of individuals have gone through. This is the Kinsey scale. So before we had the genderbread person, we had Alfred Kinsey and his colleagues at the University of Indiana, who published a blockbuster textbook that became a bestseller. I've often wondered if I could do the same, on the sexual behavior in the human male, and then a couple of years later, the sexual behavior in the human female. And he had a scale from 0 to 6, where he talked about persons on the 0 side were exclusively heterosexual with no homosexual behavior or attraction. 6 were exclusively homosexual, and those that were only attracted to persons of the same sex and only engaged in sexual behavior with those of the same sex. And then a lot of people in between. And Mr. T, given that he'd had same opposite sex behavior, even though he was attracted primarily to same sex, he'd probably be in the 4 to 5 range. And it was nice. It was a scale. It still often will be used. And there's even a a drag a cappella group called the Kinsey Sixes here in San Francisco, if you ever have a chance. They're mediocre, but they're quite fun. Encourage you to go out to them. And numbers don't lie. More and more Americans identify as non-heterosexual, and identify with either a sexual or gender minority than ever before. 5.6% of Americans in this Gallup poll done in 2021 identify as LGBT, which has gone up every year that they've done the survey. And it's different by the generation that you belong to, such as those that were the youngest generation. Gen Z respondents, about 16% of them identified as a sexual or gender minority. And it was a wide range, but each generation there was slightly less and less, down to about only 2% in those that were born in the era of World War II. And I mentioned the coming out, or I started to talk about Mr. T's coming out process. And coming out, although you may think of it as a one single event, such as what happened with Ellen in that wonderful 90s sitcom, it is actually a series of events and can be a lifelong process. It's an awareness and development of being gay, lesbian, or bisexual, and can oftentimes occur on a daily basis, so that although you may be out to everyone around you, you're still meeting new people, and you're still having to decide whether or not you want to tell them, because oftentimes it's hard to know whether somebody is LGBTQ or not, just by visual presentation alone. Primarily when I started doing this talk, it often would occur in young adulthood. I think it's getting more and more so that kids are more and more aware of this and are more and more comfortable with coming out. I think in the ABCD study that was popularized, those that were surveyed at the age of 9, 1% of them already identified as either a sexual or gender minority. Although it's a difficult question, if you look at the data, the majority of people actually didn't understand the question, but those that did were already starting to notice a difference and felt comfortable with researchers identifying as non-heterosexual or of a different gender. However, it can happen at any stage of life. You know, some people don't feel comfortable until coming out till much later. And coming out, although I mentioned here sexual identity, it also happens with gender identity as well. One of the more famous recent examples, of course, is Caitlyn Jenner, who came out much later in life to be the person that she was meaning to be. Dr. Cass and colleagues, they wrote a stages of coming out, just like there are stages of grief, there's stages of everything. We as researchers like to know about these stages. Now, however, in any individual, it's not a linear process. But this is a nice thing to think about if you are a clinician or a researcher thinking about where the person is and what kind of things, the questions you may want to ask about that stage. Starting to notice that you're confused or noticing their differences, comparing yourselves to other people, tolerance of at least your attraction and your behavior, then acceptance, pride, and finally the synthesis, so that gender identity, gender expression, sexual identity, sexual behavior all become that wonderful gingerbread person and a part of that individual. And this is another wonderful family acceptance project, which is done by researchers here in San Francisco. And it really looked at acceptance. Now, unfortunately, in Mr. T's case, he was not accepted by his family or his church community. And we know now from many years of research that actually increases the risk of suicide, homelessness, starting substances, a lot of other negative health outcomes. However, if on the flip side, you can develop acceptance, even in conservative religious families, then Caitlin Ryan and her colleagues have shown that even in the Mormon community, you can develop acceptance that synthesizes both the religion and the sexual orientation or gender identity. And that acceptance actually improves health outcomes and is protective against those negative outcomes. And there's a lot more research at the Family Acceptance Project, including wonderful guides for people that may be seeing patients primarily. This is just, the highlight of her research, such as that if you have no or lower acceptance, you have worse outcomes. But if you have more, even a little bit of acceptance, and sometimes it doesn't even have to be from the family, but it can be from an adult that you are trusted, such as a teacher or a leader within your church community, the better health outcomes you get, including better health, higher self-esteem, stronger social support, and less likely to be depressed. And then 3 times less likely to attempt suicide and to think about suicide. So that's wonderful. That puts gives you a sort of sense of a lot of things that could be involved. And we as researchers like to develop theories. And a theory that was put out in 2003 was probably being developed even before then, is called the minority stress theory, which is really trying to think about all the different reasons that persons of sexual minorities and then gender minorities might have increased risk for negative health outcomes. And so Dr. Elon Meyer and colleagues put it together such that the concept of social stress, and so previously stress was thought to be an individual behavior, but the concept of social stress extends stress theory by suggesting that conditions in the social environment, not only personal events, are sources of stress that may lead to mental and physical ill effects. And specifically, minority stress is excess stress which individuals from stigmatized social categories are exposed to as a result of their social, often a minority position. And then he drew this wonderful, complicated graph that really tried to think through all the different things that could lead to their health outcomes, either positive or negative, such as the environment in which the person is raised, including their sexual orientation, individual characteristics such as race, sexual orientation, already thinking about intersectionality, because race, ethnicity, and a lot of other things do matter in this country as well. And then all coming up together with identifying with a minority, whether that be a sexual minority, racial minority, ethnic minority. And then that can lead to a lot of things. And where it becomes stressful is when prejudice and discrimination occurs. And in the case of Mr. T, there was a lot of that. And it starts to, that individual starts to expect rejection. He starts to conceal, or she starts to conceal a lot of things, and that in of itself can create internal stress. And sometimes that can be labeled as internalized homophobia. So therefore you become so negative of an individual that you start to hate yourself because of your sexual orientation. And all of that come together. Of course, there can be support from the community, and there can be, of course, rejection from the community, and all that comes together to result in a health outcome, either positive or negative. And so it's been 20 years. And so he put out with his new colleague, Dr. Frost, an update of the minority stress model. And there's been 20 years of research on this, a wide variety of applications, some questions, but I think it still comes back to being a very important model and theory for those that are studying negative health outcomes because of the identity of being a sexual or gender minority. And when I first was doing this, I talked about the progress that the country was making, steps forward. And I created this nice purple, because it's my favorite color, timeline about the history, which unfortunately in this country is more of a pendulum, that we don't always go progressively forward or backward. So I like to start with the Stonewall riots, although if you read the curriculum, we talk about where homosexuality was first discussed in the 1800s. The APA, the American Psychiatric Association, which I'm a member of, finally removed homosexuality. It was a mental illness. And the New York Times cover, which they said was one of the most important events of that year, was that there were millions of individuals were suddenly cured by the removal of homosexuality from the DSM-2. Although it wasn't fully removed, as my colleagues like to say, until DSM-3. Of course, then politicians started to become more out. Harvey Milk specifically talked about wanting to be out in public. He was elected here in San Francisco, and unfortunately was also murdered in San Francisco. The 1980s brought the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and one of the things that I, as a medical student, was trying to get the FDA to change was that gay men were suddenly not allowed to donate blood. And it was another particular, for me, personal discrimination. that once I came out and started having same-sex behavior, I no longer was able to donate blood. It can be life-saving to a lot of individuals. 1988 was a National Coming Out Day. Don't ask, don't tell. When I was, a kid growing up, I wanted to serve in the military, but then I realized that probably was not going to work out. And so I chose not to do that. Defense of Marriage Act, the death of Matthew Shepard. And then finally, the Supreme Court did a wonderful thing by saying that anti-sodomy laws in this country were illegal. Although, of course, they're still on their books in some states, including my home state of Kansas. And I thought a lot of progress was going forward. And I was really looking at, one of my earliest research studies was looking at the timeline of suicidal ideation in LGBTQ individuals. And I was hoping that as each decade happened, that there'd be less and less of that. But unfortunately, the society has moved back and forth and back and forth. So Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. The Supreme Court allowed same-sex marriage. However, then we had a new administration, a new Supreme Court, and that slowly has been ticking back. However, one of the things that happened this year was the FDA finally allowed most gay men to donate blood, which was a long time coming and was very personal to me. However, there have been 400 anti-LGBTQ laws introduced at the state and local jurisdiction levels. And so there's been, specifically a highly profile way of trying to kick back on this progress. And this is where we are as researchers and as clinicians trying to help individuals in this community that we find ourselves in. And so it's a pendulum. It goes back and forth. And so these are just a sort of a summary of some of the things that Mr. T was having to deal with when he was growing up. Criminalization of same-sex behavior, a lot of societal discrimination, specifically around marriage. If he were to get married, he wasn't even allowed, but even then you couldn't be on your partner's insurance, you could not get health survivor benefits, you could not visit each other in the hospital. Each one of these things, society is saying that you are less than. And of course, it means that society can make the changes and right that, and all the health benefits that particularly could come out of that. And discrimination was allowed in employment, housing, and others. And so a lot of this can lead to the minority stress that Mr. T was feeling in his process. So getting back to Mr. T, he finally came out to himself at the age of 22 with the help of peer supports at his local LGBTQ community center. He developed friendships, mostly involving going out to gay bars. During his first year of coming out, he was drinking about 6 or 7 nights per week before he went off to graduate school. He came out to his close college and high school friends who were mostly, are not altogether accepting. He started an LGBTQ support group in graduate school and finally came out to his immediate family at the age of 24, sort of showing the process that coming out was for him. However, they were not very supportive. And in the process of this, his drinking escalated. And these are the stress that he was living under and that persons who are in this community were living under. They were constantly, he was choosing to hide who he was. And he was missing out on normal developmental milestones and having to do that in an environment where a lot of alcohol was being consumed. And so just because you're in graduate school doesn't mean you're free of bias. He experienced continued anti-gay bias in graduate school and postgraduate training. He was making conscious decisions daily to be more or less out. His family continued to push dates with girls, was told not to come out or come out to extended relatives for fear of consequences to his family. However, he began to date and develop his chosen family. He left the church, but he did find that he missed communal worship. His alcohol use escalated and arrested for his first DUI at the age of 28. And he found it necessary at that point to drink prior to most sexual encounters. And he found himself, of course, that most of his friends drank like him. And so he didn't necessarily see it as a problem, even with the arrest. And it talks a little bit about why there might be disparities in starting substance use, and it has to do with some of the gay socialization that is out there. Gay bars and clubs were primarily means of socialization prior to the onset of the internet. Stonewall riots, of course, started a gay bar. Drug use, when you're already a stigmatized community, drug use was not as highly stigmatized within this community. And of course, money is to be made. We are a capitalist society. And so advertisers of alcohol and cigarettes, who were legal drugs, were really learned to target LGBT communities to increase their profits. And as with Mr. T, sexual encounters with alcohol and drugs, sometimes referred to as chemsex, is quite common, especially in the gay male community. And so really coming back to sort of the disparities in substance use initiation, starting to look at the research itself. It's hard because a lot of our national surveys, they're political, they're run by political bodies, didn't include information on gender identity or sexual minority status up until the last 10 to 15 years. However, and so a lot of this had to be done by researchers doing snowball surveying and methods that weren't necessarily population-based, but were the best that they could be done at that time. So one large-scale international study showed that there are only small differences between LGBT and heterosexual identified persons and to the age of onset. So really thinking about, of course, earlier onset of substance use can lead to worse outcomes. Was there a difference in age of onset of substance use in heterosexual versus LGBT community? And so in this one large study published in 2016, there didn't seem to be, there were statistical differences, but they weren't thought to be clinically significant. In one of the few states that has really asked about sexual orientation for a consistent period of time, Massachusetts, and their youth behavioral risk survey, so showed that specifically bisexual females and gay and bisexual males had greater odds of early onset smoking compared to gender-matched peers. So there was some evidence there. And then finally looking at the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, when it finally started to ask these questions, it recently showed that lesbian and bisexual females had earlier onset of cocaine, MDMA or ecstasy and cannabis compared to their heterosexual peers. And looking at substance use initiation in the transgender community, there's even less information. However, California is leading the way in this. So one California-based cross-sectional survey found transgender adolescents started smoking 1 year earlier on average compared to their cisgender peers. So there's starting to be some evidence that substance use, specifically smoking, may occur earlier within sexual minority and gender minority communities compared to their heterosexual peers. But not a lot of evidence to that. However, what we do know is that substance use in adults and substance use disorder development is higher in this community. And so really looking at regular substance use in adolescents, bisexual adolescents report higher rates of alcohol and drug use versus lesbian, gay, and heterosexual peers. And an older meta-analysis from 2008, but I still like it, showed that their substance use compared to heterosexual peers was especially higher and bisexually identified females. And so what you're starting to see is that lumping everything together, which is what people used to do to increase our power, really diluted the findings that you could find in really looking at female, male, transgender, and then different sexual orientations, showing that the bisexual identified individuals seem to be at highest risk for regular substance use in adolescents. And a recent transgender population-based sample showed high rates of recent heavy episodic drinking, tobacco, cannabis, and other illicit substances compared to their cisgender peers. So that although they may not start earlier than their heterosexual peers, when they do start, regular use does seem to be higher in sexual and gender minorities compared to their heterosexual peers. And then adults, I'm going to get to the NISDA slides, which they have these wonderful graphics, which I'll show you. But in looking at transgender adults, looking at recent history of substance use, there are high rates of smoking and smokeless tobacco compared to their cisgender peers. And then gender nonconforming, which is a slightly different category. And so that's the other thing you have to realize and take with a grain of salt, is that a lot of studies will be assessing this differently. And especially as each generation prefers different terms or no terms at all, it makes it harder to then look at trends across time. However, in this particular study, gender nonconforming meant they didn't identify as transgender, but they weren't heterosexual, and they had some sort of nonconforming behavior or expression. Those individuals that identified with that label had higher rates of binge and heavy alcohol use, especially in females. And then, so National Survey of Drug Use and Health, of course, is a survey 12 years and older individuals that are housed. So they're non-institutionalized, not homeless individuals. So a lot of the patients that I treat, unfortunately, are not being surveyed by them. However, and they don't ask sexual orientation or gender identity questions for those that are 12 to 17. They only start to ask those questions in adults. So again, and the Trump administration actually tried to remove that from these surveys, and I was a part of a body that really fought back against that. That we really need to know information so that we can be a better community and better intervene to increase the health of all of us. So in this, looking at the past 2 most recent years, cigarette smoking, and this really looks at both males and females. You have the figure on the right, blue and red. It showed that individuals who were bisexually identified or lesbian identified had much higher rates of current cigarette smoking compared to their straight colleagues. And similarly, in the gay male community, it was the bisexual community that had high rates of smoking, and the gay, although it was slightly higher, was not statistically significant. So really, in the males being bisexual, you're more likely to report past 30 days smoking. Alcohol use, and then they start to do these wonderful graphs, and you really look at both female and male at the bottom, and then you look at their percentage of alcohol use. Alcohol, of course, is the most commonly used illicit substance in the country, and similarly with sexual minorities as well. It's slightly higher rates of alcohol use in the male, bisexual and gay community, and very much higher in the female, bisexual, and straight and lesbian community. Binge alcohol use similarly, and then heavy alcohol use, there was no difference in the male community, but in the females, heavy alcohol use was much more commonly reported in lesbian, bisexual, showing that when you come down from any to binge to heavy, where you have the higher risk of negative health outcomes, especially in the females, being lesbian or bisexual, you had higher rates of heavy alcohol use, whereas there is no real difference in the males. So some interesting findings, and you start to see how different identities can be more or less at risk for development of health consequences. And one of the things that's most often talked about in the LGBT community is methamphetamine use in gay males. And this, of course, showed that as well, so that there are much higher rates of current cocaine, specifically in methamphetamine use or prescription stimulants in gay and bisexual males compared to their straight colleagues. Actually, you probably wouldn't see that big of a difference here in San Francisco. Methamphetamine is very commonly used amongst all sexual minorities, but this, of course, is a nationally represented survey, so across the United States, you start to see these disparities. And you find, I always like to say addiction is local, addiction is related to your community. And so in the gay male community, methamphetamine use has often been used along with sexual activity. And this is just showing that finding. But similarly, in the lesbian female community, bisexual lesbian females also had higher rates of any CNS stimulant misuse compared to their straight colleagues. And so there are differences in adults, there are differences in regular use in kids, in adolescents. So let's get back to Mr. T before we get to substance use disorder disparities, and then finishing up our talk. So unlike the rest of his community, Mr. T actually did not start drinking until the age of 21, much later because of his Baptist upbringing and lack of access in the home. He did try cannabis and smoking cigarettes once, but did not like the effect. So really, his primary drug of choice was alcohol. And then lastly, another thing that unfortunately is more common in the LGBTQ community is adverse childhood experiences, which are also associated with development of mental health and substance use disorders, such as bullying, sexual harassment, violence, and assault, homelessness. LGBTQ individuals are always overly represented in the population of homelessness. It has to do with family rejection and feeling not safe at home. So all of that is much more common and is, brought to fore with, of course, our case with Mr. T, but in a lot of things. And it's another thing that unfortunately is associated with worsening disparities in development of substance use disorders. So our last agenda item, we're finally here. We both hear some good news and bad news, but first the good news. So Mr. T finally sought treatment for his alcohol use disorder after another night of drinking in which he cheated on his partner again, performed his job while intoxicated, and was arrested for a second DUI. He was given time away. He had a job where he was able to take time away to complete an intensive outpatient program, which started on Antabuse, which is, of course, FDA approved for the treatment of alcohol use disorder. He entered weekly group therapy and ongoing monitoring in his place of employment for the next 2 years, showing that, of course, treatment, the longer you are in treatment, of course, the better the outcomes. He felt safe to be open about his sexual orientation and his history with sexual assault during his individual group therapy. He became active in Alcoholics Anonymous, attending AA daily for his first 2 years, finding a strong LGBTQ community in recovery. He re-engaged with outpatient mental health treatment for his major depressive disorder. So a lot of good things and a lot of resources were available that he was able to take advantage of to turn his life around. So going back to, we've heard about higher rates of substance use. What about substance use disorders? And similarly, as you would probably imagine, there are higher rates of alcohol use disorder and substance use disorder in sexual minorities compared to their heterosexual peers. We look at any substance on the right, you'll see the NISDA, the same report, 2021, 2022, showing that there are higher rates of any substance use disorder. And you start to dig down, you start to see what is it. It's not in females, it is a little bit more opioids. In males, a little bit more alcohol, and any drug use disorders, so non-opioid or non-alcohol. And then you look at categories of individuals on the right for alcohol use disorder, and you start to see those that are in the late 20s have the highest rates of being having meeting criteria for alcohol use disorder, which is interesting because it's not necessarily the case with the heterosexual peers. So that Mr. T, when he came to fore, he probably was diagnosed with alcohol use disorder, although he didn't know that. He came into treatment in his mid-30s, so he'd be right there as well. But interestingly enough, and this has been shown repeatedly, the LGBT community actually seeks treatment at a higher rate than their heterosexual peers. And although the message is very few Americans actually receive any substance use disorder treatment, according to the NISDA and other population-based surveys. But if you are identified, and this is somewhat harder to see and was published in Drug and Alcohol Dependence recently in 2021, when you look at any substance use disorder treatment or specialty, which is, California is certified as a specialty substance use disorder treatment provider, those that identify as gay and lesbian, versus bisexual, in especially men, but also women, have higher rates of attending specialty substance use disorder compared to their heterosexual peers. Although the heterosexual is only 7% and it's only 10%. So this is, of all the individuals that had met diagnostic criteria for a use disorder, less than 1 in 10 are actually seeking and receiving care, unfortunately. But if you are a sexual minority, you're more likely to seek care. And I provide that a yes, queen. And you start to Google and you can find lots and lots of specialty programs that have specialty services in the SUD community for sexual minorities and gender minorities. And this graph takes a look at that. So there's a survey, the National Survey on Substance Abuse Treatment Services, or NSATS, that actually asks, its self-report, whether or not you have specialty services for the LGBTQ community. And you start to see after 2012, which is when the Affordable Care Act happened, a higher number, still it's only about 20%, started to develop specialty programs, specialty services for the LGBT community. Other researchers have actually tried to see what does it mean to have specialty services, and the answers are not as fun and exciting, but it shows you that people are trying and people are offering that. And you're more often to see it in for-profit, interestingly enough, as opposed to county-owned programs, which is the ones that I run. And there's a lot of geographic variability. So the West Coast has much more specialty LGBTQ community focus compared to the Northeast, interestingly enough. And then what happens after you get into treatment? And really, this was a very interesting study. I encourage people to look at it. It's called the National Recovery Study, which follows people who've been in long-term recovery, potentially Mr. T, who was cross-sectional, and it looked at U.S. adults who received a specialty, who had a resolved what they called alcohol or drug use problem. There's 2,002 individuals, and then looked at a wide variety of outcomes. And really looked at the outcomes based upon how many years since the recovery had occurred. And so as you would expect, the quality of life, the psychological distress, happiness, recovery capital all went up over time. Interestingly enough, except for the sexual minorities, there's always a disparity, so that, you know, the quality of life never got back up to the same level as their heterosexual peers in long-term recovery for persons that identify as sexual minorities. The psychological distress also sort of flatlined, and it goes to show you the problems that are still there. Although their drug or substance use may have resolved, there's still a lot of things in society and minority stress that are occurring. And sadly, the self-esteem seemed to go down over time.
Yeah.
Which is
What's up with that? Yeah. That looks bad.
They didn't really comment on that, but I have a lot of questions about that, but it shows you that, you know, recovery is possible. People are seeking it, but it doesn't seem like they're having as much benefit as their heterosexual peers in terms of being in recovery. So to end and to open up for questions, to finish off with Mr. T's journey, he's been in recovery from alcohol use disorder for the past 11.5 years, maintaining an active AA program. He has progressed in his employment. He is married. He has a renewed sense of connection with his family and is actually re-engaged with organized religion, although not the Baptist Church. So I'll end there with a lot of resources, a reminder about National Coming Out Day, and my contact information. And I'll stop sharing, and we'll open up to questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tompkins, for that outstanding presentation and overview. Very, very informative. And I'm going to open up the floor to questions, and if not, I have a few to ask. Yes, go ahead, Edmund.
Thanks, Andy, so much. It's really wonderful to hear from you. Could you comment on disparities among LGBTQ persons and the prevalence of syndemics? In other words, you know, co-occurring mental health and substance use and homelessness. What do we know about comparatively about disparities in more than one diagnosis or challenge? Do we see a detrimental synergy happening there, or is it just follow the pattern of disparities that we see for a single condition?
So I had to cut some things. In looking at NISDA as well, there are, of course, increased disparities in mental health diagnoses, in addition to substance use disorders. And as I probably alluded to a little bit, in homelessness, especially in homeless youth, the LGBT community are widely outnumbered and higher percentage compared to the general population in terms of who are home unhoused and all the consequences of that. And so it appears to be compounded. And I mean, it's somewhat similar to heterosexuals in the sense that if you have an opioid use disorder, if you have a substance use disorder, you're likely to have a co-occurring psychiatric condition. It just seems to be even worse in the LGBTQ community.
Mandana, you had some questions.
Yes. Andy, one of the very important aspect of our network is engaging the community in the important issues and areas of disparities that need to be addressed, and encouraging the early stage investigators to better communicate, connect, and engage with the community. And I'm wondering if you have any thought processes, suggestions for resources, and also how the ESIs can actually proceed in that way.
Well, there is a strong community advocacy network in the LGBTQ community. It started with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and so there are long-term survivors of HIV that have been involved in research and are now involved in a lot of research, especially at Ward 86 and other San Francisco HIV/AIDS related researchers. They're less so in the SUD treatment community, although we do have a strong program called the Alliance Health Project here in San Francisco that has begun, not necessarily with my assistance, but I do advise in developing specific programs for SUD community. And then they've developed a research team on top of that to really evaluate outcomes from that. And so there would be a strong resource. Now, the recovery community that I spoke about with Mr. T, they also are a resource. Those that are involved in AA or 12-step-based recovery have a strong network, and that they believe in assisting researchers and could be another way for community members to have a say in development of research. And then in my own community of addiction treatment, we've started our first community advisory board for our research staff. And it's open to anyone with addiction, so it's not necessarily focused on LGBTQ individuals, but I hope once we establish one, and if there's a strong desire, I'd say about between 5 and 10% of our people that we serve identify as a sexual or gender minority, potentially could also help advise young researchers and engage them around these questions of health disparities. I didn't mention, because I ran out of time, like there are specific psychological treatments. There are even some medications that are geared towards men who have sex with men who have methamphetamine use disorder. There seems to be some unique treatments that might benefit, as well as specific populations. And so there's a lot more questions that could be asked and a lot more researchers. And I found with this particular community, they really want to engage research. They really have a strong belief in research and the power of it. And so I'd encourage you, if you haven't been able to reach out to them, sort of reach out to me, and I'll connect people for that.
Thank you very much for that information. Another question that comes to mind, you rightfully so alluded to intersectionality and its importance, especially in this area of research. Can you speak to what particular elements of the intersectionality that you would consider be of most sort of salient aspects that really does require addressing, especially recognizing the advocacy that you are engaged in?
Well, I think women, especially minority, ethnic and racially minority women who do not identify as heterosexual, are particularly underserved community and have higher risk for sexual violence, higher risk for poor outcomes in substance use disorder treatment, and poor outcomes with when they have children with the CPS system. And so, I have a new researcher, Caravella Christian, who's really wanting to focus on that community. But I think, in general, that would be one area that could really benefit. And they're hard to recruit. And so really what we're trying to do is develop just a desire for individuals and to be one to participate in research. And her research is specifically on app development. So really learning technology and how to engage women and to use technology for improving their STD treatment outcomes. Because what I think
Wonderful.
would be helpful is for our SUD treatment community who are serving these patients, oftentimes they don't have the resources or the time to really develop these wonderful programs, and so we as a community can be assisting in that, and certainly there's a desire for that in San Francisco and across the country.
Wonderful. Well, we're on top of the hour, and we have received quite a bit of shout outs for your outstanding presentation in the chat. Once again, thank you for all the information, and really appreciate it. We look forward to our next webinar in January. Thank you, Dr. Tompkins.
Thank you, and thank you for taking the time to learn with me.